Okay, so welcome back, everyone. I'm just going to do a brief introduction. Joanna the Groot and I go back, she just told me 30 years. I didn't realize it was that long. And we've had very similar interests, and it was just natural to think of her as being our keynote speaker for the conference. She's a senior lecturer in history at the University of York in the United Kingdom. She earned her doctorate from Oxford for research on the social history of 19th century Iran, which has remained a core focus for her research and teaching. She's published extensively in the field on cultural, political, ideological aspects of modern Iranian history, dealing with the roles of gender, religion, and nationalism, and with historiographical issues, including a range of conference presentations on those topics. Her work on Iranian history informs and intersects with her research, publishing, and teaching in the fields of gender, imperialism, sexuality, and Orientalism. She's currently working on a monograph on the social history of 19th century Iran, which is soon to be published by Cambridge University Press. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, thanks to the conference organizers for giving me this slot. I feel quite nervous and humble, because as I've been listening to the papers today, I'm thinking, oh, well, actually, I'm not going to offer anything very new. I'm just going to take a bit further things that people are already talking about. But I think it's a testimony to the conference organizers and the conference members that the amazing level of work that we're doing here together over this couple of days. And I was going to make a joke about not embarrassing either Janet or myself by talking about how many years it is since we first met. I have a very happy memory of looking at Impressionist paintings in the art gallery in Chicago in the interstices of a conference where we actually had our first encounter. So, as Janet has said, I'm bringing my experience of being a historian of Iran and also of things to do with sort of gender, imperialism, and Orientalism. And I apologize to people who work on other parts of the Middle East and North Africa if I don't give sufficient attention to the big themes that I'm dealing with, drawing on their experience, although I will try and make some references to the things I know about Egypt and the Ottoman lands where I can. I think I also probably need, I do need to apologize for the pictures that I shall be showing you, the images I shall be showing you, which not in any way like the wonderful and carefully curated material which Pedram has assembled and which you'll have already benefited from, and you'll be hearing more about, I think, in a later session. What I'm doing is offering a think piece. It's not particularly based on particular pieces of research of my own, just on my general experience of working in the field of Iranian history. And what I'm aiming to do is to raise some issues and problems relevant to the range of papers and interests at the conference. I'm going to begin by referring to two 20th century textual attempts to come to terms with gender, sex, and slavery in Iran. And the first of those is a story originally published in 1961 by Simin Daneshvar called A City Like Paradise, Shahr Chun Behesht, a fictional exploration of sex and servitude for women in a southern Iranian household. Daneshvar herself came from Shiraz in the south of Iran, southwest of Iran, and linked to the stories of slavery and of African identity. So there are themes to do with black kings, there are themes to do with the building of the pyramids and who were the coerced or enslaved labor that might have built the pyramids, themes to do with Africanness existing in this Iranian setting. Quite interestingly, not a privileged, but not massively elite setting, the households in which the women who are the descendants of enslaved Africans, now I guess some kind of Afro-Iranian they might be described, are living out their lives, are families themselves that are struggling with a kind of genteel respectability. But what's interesting is that the situation of the central protagonist, Mehrangiz, seen through the eyes of a boy and a young man, which in another context I might comment on, are woven into the life and problems of this struggling middle-class family, but also with sexual issues, themes of cultural resistance, of memory, of enacting of African pasts among people of African descent in Shiraz, her mother's flight in order to have a child with another Afro-Iranian. There are some interesting dramas there of resistance as well as of oppression. So that's, if you like, one way we could approach, or one way in which a writer in the 1960s chose to approach the history of sex and slavery and ethnicity in Iran. The second is more academic, an article by a former colleague of mine, Haleh Afshar, who worked in the same university as I do, an article written in the year 2000 on somebody whose picture you can see in the wonderful exhibition, Sonbol Baji. And the title of the article is Age, Gender and Slavery in and Out of the Persian Harem. And it presents Haleh Afshar's memories from probably the late 1950s or early 1960s, and an analysis of the memories of a woman who began as an enslaved member of Muzaffar ad-Din Shah's household, but became the beloved nanny in Haleh's own family. And it presents the royal Underun as a site where Sonbol acquires skills, both cultural and practical, and says that Sonbol emphasized the pleasures of a shared female milieu rather than experiencing exploitation, coercion, and power relations, sexual or otherwise. It attempts to be a very firm, affirmative statement about the life of this woman, something we can think about. Interestingly, Haleh Afshar in 2000 could still talk about the existence of enslaved people in Iran as some sort of minuscule and not particularly significant feature of the history of Iran. And I think this conference and all the work that we've been talking about testifies to how things have rather moved on since she wrote that. I'm going to focus on a couple of major areas, and I'm going to begin with an obvious and banal point, but one which still needs to be emphasized. We need, as good scholars, whether we are scholars of the present or of the past, to have gendered readings of sexuality and also sexualized readings of gender, just as we need gendered and sexualized readings and approaches to slavery. And I think that many of the papers have demonstrated what the scholars in this room have achieved in that way. So that's my first sort of major theme, and I'll keep coming back to it. Sorry, just moving my bits and nuts here. Okay, I'm trying to move the slide and it's not moving for me. So, my first image, which has two items in it for you to think and reflect on. The first on the left, a scene of what we might think of as an intimate erotic encounter, but one which includes spectators and assistants, as well as two main protagonists. And I would encourage you to ask the question, is this anything more than a visualization of some literary trope? The servants, some of whom you can see are portrayed as of African descent, assisting an erotic encounter, or is it a glimpse of a whole set of classed, raced, and gendered dynamics? And in another context, I'd actually talk about how it challenges us to not think about simple public-private boundaries when we talk about the sexual dynamics of a household. So that's the painting on the left from the mid-19th century. The photograph on the right invites you to think about an elite household understood through a number of differences and hierarchies of age, ethnicity, and also of what we might think of as class or status. So a group of males of different ages and stages and different ethnicities. What is this all about? What have been their roots into the places that they occupy as they pose for that photograph? And that leads me to my second big point, something we've been already talking about, but I want to, as it were, foreground, the importance of power relationships, perhaps rather than identity approaches to sex and servitude. There's some very interesting work done. I don't know if anybody knows the early modernist historian Valerie Traub's work on thinking sexuality. I mean, her particular theoretical stance is not one I'd share, but one of the things she does is to open up some of the difficulties of using a purely identity badging of sexual relationships, relationships of servitude, enslavement, or coercion. And I do want to suggest, and I think somebody was raising this point this morning, that the choosing to describe people who used to be described as slaves as enslaved persons, and of describing what used to be called slavery as enslavement, just as using terms like sex worker or sex trafficking or the sale and purchase of sexual services rather than words like prostitute or prostitution, allows us to locate those notions, those activities, as matters of acts and relationships, not abstract, institutionalized, or essentialist identities. So the word prostitute or the word slave, carrying as it does this very now difficult and kind of culturally overloaded baggage, is one that we need maybe not to throw away, but to at least question quite seriously. And I think the reason why I tend to talk about sex workers or sellers of sexual services and not prostitutes, why I would talk about enslaved people rather than slaves, is to foreground that issue and that problem. Okay, so I'm going to move on. And here I want to very quickly remind ourselves, because I'm sure I'm reminding of something that you're very familiar with, that thinking about enslaved persons in Iran in the 19th century, and I think in parts of the Ottoman lands also, is not only a matter of that household-based or familiarly based forms of enslavement, but as that photograph from southeastern Iran taken by a British diplomat, Sir Percy Sykes, and lodged in the British Museum and having been nicely tinted up, of rural people, including people of African descent, reminds us of that world of African origin, people of African origins who end up laboring in various ways. We heard about the pearl trade earlier today. We could think about various forms of cultivation in which enslaved African or Afro-Iranians and their children became involved in those activities. Interestingly, if you go to the quite famous memoir of Taj al-Saltaneh, where she talks about her nanny, she says, well, the reason that I had this nanny and my mother had a series of people of African origin in various parts of her household, which was a subset of Nasruddin Shah's household, was because one of her relatives had been a governor in Kerman and Baluchistan, where this was much more common. So I put up that picture there to contrast with perhaps the more familiar picture taken from Nasruddin Shah's private quarters, where you've got the relationship of women to Africans or people of African origin, enslaved, servants, whatever, in that context. Often we could associate that also with eunuchs. So what we're talking about is institutions and identities which are made, which are contested, which are manipulated, often within relations of unequal power. The trafficker in enslaved persons, the elate woman managing servants and enslaved people, the photographers, the models, the users, the donors, the recipients of erotic paintings or photographs. So having put all that out, what I want to do now, if I'm not running too much behind time, is to offer 3 fields for your further consideration. And the first of those is the theme of power and inequality versus agency and autonomy. And there was a very lively discussion about that during the first session. And I think it's quite useful to think about power, inequality, agency, and autonomy by thinking about people managing the different hierarchies of age, of gender, and ethnicity within a household, within a workplace, within other kinds of settings. So I think that that's, if you like, an important way in which we could say that enslavement, for example, is a terrain of unequal power, but modified by the agency of the enslaved. So it isn't either they were oppressed, exploited, coerced, commodified, treated as chattels, had their children taken away from them or whatever. It is that in that context, they were also persons who struggled, managed, adapted, resisted, and that the stories that we should be opening up are exactly some of those stories. And I think perhaps the story of Ziba Khanum that we heard earlier would be one where we could think about that and think about it as we were suggested to do in a gendered way. And just to sort of add another dynamic, I'll move us to the next set of pictures, which you can think about as who is playing, what are the networks of relationships, what are the different contributions and inequalities that are shaping people's behavior, people's treatment of one another, people's attempt to survive and get on. The woman and the eunuch, Anissa Doyle and Malijak. Different kinds of enslaved Africans or enslaved people of African origin ending up in different roles, from eunuch to skilled attendant in a household to debt labourer in the pearl fishing industry, and so forth. So what I'm thinking about there is that we are at the early stage of developing, I think, an understanding of what we might call the agency of the enslaved. We're not as far forward as our colleagues who work on enslavement and enslaved people in the Americas or the Caribbean, but we're beginning to get there. I think we've begun to hear that in some of these stories and experiences that have already come out. And it takes a number of forms, doesn't it, that management or resistance or adaptation to enslavement and coercion. It might be the forming of intimate relationships in household structures, which we can understand in a gendered way when we think of the enslaved women who as the carers for children, as the sex or bed partners of males who had sexual access to them, could find ways to manage, to benefit, to progress, to at least to protect themselves within that very unequal dynamic. And I thought that the way Manu set some of that up earlier today was a very helpful way to think about it. There's also the interesting sets of relationships between enslaved people and their manumitted peers. There's a wonderful study of an arson case in Istanbul, which I'm sure some of you read the article that deals with that explores the complicated way in which people who were still designated as enslaved were operating in networks, in this case in Istanbul, with manumitted or freed enslaved people, but who felt the ethnic and historic links, communal links with one another that enabled them to resist, to protect, and indeed to misbehave in various ways, if you want to put it that way. So that's one thing we could think about, intimate relationships, advancing themselves through skill and economic agency. And I think that, thinking about the way in which that changed in the 19th century, if we were early modernists, we'd be talking about what were the career paths for men in the Ottoman and to a later extent the Safavid state systems, which recruited the people to military and administrative roles on an enormous scale and recruited men, some of whom were understood as enslaved or described in that way. But of course that's not quite the same in the context of the 19th century. And I think that some of the work that colleagues like Befnas Mirzai have done are opening up some of the complexities of that. And the other thing I think we could think more about is the way in which people who come from outside of Iran or outside of the Ottoman lands but end up as in Cairo or Istanbul or Bushehr or Tehran or wherever, Esfahan, might maintain and refigure the cultures which they brought into the new settings that they were now living in, to what extent they leave behind, to what extent they maintain songs, stories. Taj al-Sultaneh talks about her nanny having a particular dialect, for example, which was perhaps the dialect of her southeastern Iranian African background, and the way that when she got back to talk to her, she could pick up that dialect and accent and use it as part of her intimacy with her former nanny. I think we do still need to think about the elephant in the room, a persuasive narrative of the non-oppressive or non-violent character of household and domestic slavery. And you heard my thoughts on that a little earlier today, so I won't burden you with repeating them. I think it's important that we don't use notions of the household and the domestic to somehow lighten too much the notion of control and coercion, although I do think we have to look at the specifics of household and domestic slavery in the Middle East and North Africa. I think it's important not to resist, however, a proper appreciation of the coercive, subordinating and controlling features, and indeed the racializing features of enslavement in its different forms. And I think the stories of the so-called humorous cruelty perpetrated upon enslaved women, for example, in the court of Fath Ali Shah, and some similar stories about the court of Nasruddin Shah, give us interesting hints of that, if you like, underside. And I think also once you have a gendered and sexualized reading of enslavement, you have to think about the problematic understanding of the sexual availability of women to men in those household settings, to what extent that was a space for resistance and advantage, but to what extent it was also still about coercion and unequal power. And I think later on we'll be thinking about this in relation, for example, to photography, in the kinds of photography, erotic photography, which some of you have already looked at, I'm sure, and we'll be hearing more about in other sessions. We need to ask what degrees of choice, consent, or agency for the women subjects of those photos were present. Content, poses, forms of undress. Were they imposed? Were they negotiated? What were they? And it may be the answers we won't know, but we have to ask the question in order to understand, if you like, that spectrum of vulnerability and unfreedom. I like the idea of the spectrum of vulnerability. I think that's a very rich notion. And this segues, I think, into thinking about power, consent, negotiation, and resistance in sexual relationships, whether they're familial or commercialized, or combinations of the two. And I think the discussion we've already had about ciré in its most elite forms, but also in the forms in which we know, for example, Haja Sayad describing Kerman in the 1870s, talking about women using the convention of ciré basically to operate as the sellers of sexual services as a way of maintaining themselves economically. So there's a complex story there, and I think it segues into more contemporary present-day discussions of those kinds of issues. So I think that there's a gender dynamic, there are hierarchies of status and employment, degrees of commercialization and commodification around the erotic, both the actual sale of sexual services, but perhaps also of erotic performance, of erotic photography. And we could think about the power and sexiness of the erotic and the erotic and sexy charge of the powerful, if you wanted to get into the kind of rich cultural dynamic of that. And they are mediated by power relations and inequality, but also mediated by intimacy, persisting relationships, pleasure, in which subalterns have some agency as well as the powerful. And we might then go on to ask, what are the Iranian, Egyptian, or Turkish versions of debates in other parts of the world and discourses about sex work as an occupation, a form of labour, sex workers as victims, as members of the unruly, immoral sections of society. We've heard about some of that in the context of Istanbul and the Ottoman lands, or as objects of moral concern for high-minded reformers and modernisers. Quite often, I would say, there's a gender dynamic to that, but it's an interesting gender dynamic because the campaigning around the sex industry in late 19th and early 20th century, Ottoman Empire, Egypt, and other parts of the world was often led by a particular female tradition of radical critique being brought in by often European and American women wanting to bring their, as they saw it, emancipating and civilizing debate to their benighted sisters in other parts of the world, whether that's in India with the CD, Venereal Disease Acts, whether it's in the Ottoman Empire and the challenges of managing the sex industry there. And I think that, for example, Robinson Dunn's work on 19th century Egypt shows a discourse of rescue and reform rooted in anti-slavery discourse, in moral discourses against the selling of sexual services, but projected through European reformers onto occupied Egypt, as it was by the 1880s. And we need to ask, so where are the local discourses? We caught little glimpses of that, I thought, in the discussion about prostitution in Istanbul and erotic performance in Istanbul, and we might want to think further about that in later sessions of the conference. So I think that it's interesting how, for some people, slavery and sex work, and being victims of both, get equated, although actual studies of sex work in Egypt and the Ottoman lens suggest a much more complicated set of realities and discourses. How much longer have you got? 5 minutes? Okay. So I just want to say two other things. One, I'm deeply worried about binaries, and I was very sympathetic to whichever of the colleagues, and I apologise for not remembering, who said, actually we do need to, I think it was actually your colleague who did the introduction, getting away from that and thinking about spectrums or different registers of coercion, of commercialisation, of body power. So castration, non-consensual pregnancy, or the non-consensual termination of pregnancy, the removal or control of children, which we heard about a lot, which has a lot to do with sex, gender, family, but also with enslavement and the power of those who are in control or able to coerce and manage slaves. And that reminds us, of course, of all the routes into and out of slavery. So that would be one place where to avoid binary. I would also say that was true of sexual desires, activities and relationships, that issues of consent and coercion, as well as labour, the overlap of family and household with work, with trade in people, with the spectrum of different kinds of marriage and everything. I thought, you know, the way Manu talked about the court of Fat Ali Shah is a model which we could also think about in rather different settings. We could also think of, if you really want to, I was reading that, some of you will have read that article about sex work in Aleppo, where it turns out it's a family enterprise. That some members of the family are acting as the procurers and pimps, other members of the family are providing the sexual services, and we know this because through the court records, when the community gets upset about this, we get those glimpses of descriptions. So thinking about who is involved in the commercialized versions of sexual relationships, it opens up all sorts of issues that are not simply, you know, the oppressed and the oppressor. And then very lastly, I think thinking about hybridity and intersectionality, I wanted to say intersectionality, and I think I'm very pleased that that's come up so much. I don't really need to say that much more about it. But I do want to just think a little bit about how the area of sexuality and sexual relationships, and perhaps particularly commercial versions, intersects in quite problematic and interesting ways with performance. And there are simply three different kinds of performers. A group of women musicians, top left, dressed, of course, interestingly in male-style attire, and that relates to something that we were hearing about earlier. A dancer, okay, performing, as you can see, for an elite audience outside a very splendid tent, a female dancer, and then some boy dancers on the right. And I think what that reminds us is, do we think of these as skilled performers? These are people who can sing, can dance, can perform in various ways, making their living in the world of showbiz, as it were, but of course not necessarily a commercialized world, a world in which it is elite people who can commandeer in various ways those performances. And how does that relate to the kind of more commercialized performances that we were hearing about earlier on? Well, I think you've had enough of me. I think we can think about sexualization as a form of work, but we can also think about how it's constituted through a range of discursive and cultural elements, which I think we'll be talking more about, particularly when we come to talk about photography, but we've already understood from talking about the regulation both of the sex industry, but also of erotic performance. The role of regulation as a performative, symbolic thing for the state, for the community, for the law, which are often the source of most of our records, which possibly may distort our understandings of how to understand sex work and the sale of sexual services, but also the role of desire and imagination, the way in which creative art, erotic art, is a product which is about power, a product which can be about commerce, but also one that is about exploring the desires, the pleasures, the hopes, the fears around sexual matters. And then I think also of classification and organisation. And I'm just going to leave you with a last picture which might just keep you reflecting as we move into the next section. I think that what I want to say is that images like this, images of servitude or of sexual labour, of enslavement, are also reminders of the richness, the complexity, the intersectional dynamism of cultural and material forms, and of the power relations which underpinned life and labour in households, communities, and intimate relations. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.